let's just jump right in and talk about what it was like for, maybe if you want to go first, Yvette, like exiting the life.
So for me, exiting the life involved a short stint in jail and then going into direct care services. And I stayed there in a residential home for 2.5 years. And then when my time was up, they opened the doors and I walked out, but I had no resources or anything. So I ended up going home to be with family just so that I could get stability. I had 2 children with me at the time as well, so that's how I emerged from the life.
So it was jail that kind of allowed that transition to happen.
Yes.
From being in the life to not anymore.
Yes.
Like at the end.
Yes.
Okay. And what about you, Keeya?
Yeah, well, when I exited the life, this was 1997, and so my brother was actually my rescuer.
Okay.
And so I went to live with him and his wife, and there were no services at that time that I knew of. So it was just being in a regular environment again, trying to live normal.
Mm-hmm.
And so I wasn't able to take advantage of services. This was 97, so there wasn't a lot out there. Right.
So that was like the end, or kind of like one of your last transitions, maybe before like kind of the recovery journey began. Sometimes I like to talk about the fact that it takes it's a long journey sometimes to truly be, for survivors to be out of the life, or for that full transition to happen. It's not always like a one and done. Sometimes it is, sometimes it may not be. So even though that was your time like in jail, where that immediate kind of stop happened, what was the journey like for you leading up to that? Do you know what I mean?
So the journey leading up to me exiting the life the last time, there was many other times before that. And I think it's, in my case, exiting the life also has to do with recovery from drug addiction. So I think that there's a conversation to be had about, being trafficked and exploited, and then an addiction. So sometimes just emerging and going into regular spaces like to family. For me, I needed that additional level of comprehensive care. And I had done that, Lindsey, over many, many years. I was on and off the streets for 18 years. And, every 3 months, every 6 months, every year, I wanted to exit. But I also had an addiction. And I also didn't have the skills to create a life for myself that was sustainable. I didn't have the tools, and I didn't have the support. Like Keeya was saying, there really weren't services that were that comprehensive at the time. I mean, you could go into rehabilitation, but trafficking was still criminal. I mean, being exploited was still criminalized. Yeah. So there was penalties that came along with being in the life. So I can't tell you how many times I exited and re-entered. And it was 2008 when I last was on the streets. And the last time I used was 2008. So it's never linear. It's always, back and forth, to and fro, especially depending on the level of trauma that a survivor is having to emerge from. Yeah. Makes it very different.
Yeah. Right. It's real. I think with the survivors I worked with through the years, I think that's a lot of times a myth that people think of, is they're out and it's over, and what people don't often realize is that there's this long trajectory that probably is lifelong. I mean, you guys can speak to that is not just this, okay, they're out, hooray, and I think that that is something we see time and time again, story after story, where it is this up and down and setback and 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, but we're having some movement in progress, or like 4 steps forward, 10 steps back. Right. And I think that's something people don't often think about, when they hear about human trafficking, is that long journey after the exit or the transition out of the life. I don't know.
Right.
What about you? Like, once you left, because yours was a little bit more kind of, it was a start and stop, right? Or was there a moment where you kind of did dabble back into it?
No, I didn't dabble back into it, but the struggle was tremendous to assimilate back into society and living so-called normal life, because I really lived in the space of denial that, number one, I had been abused to the level that I did. I made it in my mind like my story was, this is a bad dream. You know, I am going to put all of this behind me, and the best way to do that is to hide it, which
Stuff it down.
Stuff it down.
Yeah.
Okay, red flag number one. And just get on with life, right?
Yeah.
So I knew I needed basic things. I needed a job, and those different things. But the mental weight of the trauma that I experienced, it was like a demon that I battled with daily. And so that led to different things like hopping around a lot of jobs, you know, because I didn't like small talk. I didn't want to talk about, you know, periods of times that normally there should be certain milestones being hit, but instead, you know, I was in the life. And so there were no milestones that I was hitting. And so I just tried my best to hide. And that led to a lot more pain, the pain being very disruptive, the mental health issues being very disruptive in my life. And then I didn't want to address those issues through therapy for years, because then that would say, I have a problem.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
then I'd have to talk to someone about it. And it's like, who wants to do that? I'd rather just get on with life, right?
That's real.
And see, I was involved with systems. So I had criminal charges. Child protective services were involved. And so emerging was complicated because it's almost like stepping into a net, because there's all these systems of accountability that often come with, you know, severe consequences and judgment and, you know, tropes that are attached to the female, unholy female body, or the over-sexualized female body, or the exploited female body. And so sometimes, and that's one of the things that I like to talk about, and you know that, Lindsey, is sometimes emerging or exiting the life is complicated because the manifestation of our trauma is criminalized.
Yeah.
Right? And so you come out, but you still have to go to court. You emerge, but you still have to deal with CPS and housing restrictions, and you emerge, but you still have no real solid qualifications for gainful employment that's going to be like really create sustainable living for perhaps myself and my children.
Yeah.
And so emerging can be, you know, complicated by the systems that are in place to, you know, protect society and hold the exploited or the victim accountable. I'm not saying that it's wrong.
No, yeah.
But if you have to navigate that without advocacy or allyship, and you don't have the language and you don't have the familial support, it's just,
it's a whole nother
almost
layer
impossible.
of trauma
Right.
added on. I mean, you've had the trauma of the exploitation, and then you come out and have to find your way through systems and help and trust, like figuring out, like, can I trust, you know, this system or this judge or you know, whatever. And we see that a lot with kids, is they got to go through CPS, and they got, and it's almost like the unknown of being out in the life is more safe, felt safety to them than coming into systems and a bunch of people they don't know, and someone else is deciding where I'm going, and things like that. And that's real. Yeah, that's real.
Well, and another thing, when you're exiting the life, in addition to those systems that you're speaking of, because I also had legal issues, and so getting gainfully employed was very difficult, and took years and finally a lot of money to get certain records sealed that could be sealed. But it was the self-esteem issues, because yes, I knew, okay, if I'm going to make it in this world, I'm going to need an education, but I didn't feel smart enough. And I left home at a young age. I was 16 years of age, so I had to get a GED, but I didn't believe I was smart enough. So I was 25 years old before I got my GED in May of 2000.
Wow.
And then even after I got my GED, I had to believe that I was smart enough to go into college, and that took years. And so I would register for classes, and then it would get difficult, and I would freak out, and all these other dynamics would come into play with my mental health, and then I would withdraw because I'm like, I'm not built for this.
Yeah.
I can't do this. And so I started classes in 2002. I'm a senior now.
Wow.
All right. That is how many years?
Yeah.
We're talking about 20 years
Yeah.
span that it took a lot of therapy to finally believe that I could do it just like anyone else. And so, and that's just one layer.
Yeah.
And so there's
One
so
layer,
many
wow.
different ways when you turn that around on its head. There's so many different ways that survivors are impacted just to do what's considered normal, right?
Yeah.
It comes at a tremendous cost.
Yeah, that's profound.
I think that what you said, just to do what is normal, like, I'm curious, what do you think the expectations are? What do you think about the expectations that we as society or people put on survivors? Did you feel this sort of like, this is what I should accomplish, or this is these maybe unrealistic expectations for healing or freedom, or do you think that we maybe even as service providers or just people in the community put unrealistic expectations on survivors coming out of the life?
In my experience, direct care service providers, social service systems, law enforcement do have unhealthy expectations for victims, because one of the things I was just reflecting on is this lack of regard for childhood trauma. And so they want to deal with you based on what they see in the moment, which might be a 25-year-old victim with, that's on the corner and is addicted and all these different things. And there's a very shallow dig into just how deep that trauma may be. So for me, for instance, at the age of 6, and so you're dealing with me at 25, and you're dealing with me based on, oftentimes a very shallow perception of the depth of my trauma. And then allies and advocates are often looking at a survivor from their own lens.
Right.
And that complicates the journey for me, because we have very different backgrounds.
Yeah.
You were coloring, and not you, but an individual, a direct care service provider, law enforcement.
Yeah.
They're looking at, well, when I was 6, I was playing in the sandbox and I was this. Well, I was too, but at home, I was being touched by a sibling. And so if you don't really have that nuanced sensibility about what a victim may have endured, then obviously we're going to project, because we all do.
Good.
Oh, come on, you can do this. I did it. You got this. I had it. We can. And it's like, wait a minute. Everything in me is broken.
Yeah.
There's nothing in me that hasn't been bruised, touched, wounded, or in fact still bleeding. In a metaphor sense. And so there is a rush often to recovery. And that's our society, right? We rush. We want to microwave dinner. We don't want to cook it. We want to pour the potatoes in the pot. We don't want to peel them,
So real.
And so when it comes to recovery, it's like, hey, you got 30 days. Well, I've been doing drugs since I was 9.
Right.
So I don't know what you think this 30 days is going to do.
Right.
But if we took the years of trauma and made a more sensible equation about what the trajectory of recovery may be, that would require us to do that deep dive into, knowing history.
Yeah.
Right.
And a lot of service providers don't have the resources, they don't have the time, they don't have the people to really do that work. And so I do, and I went the way of education. I just kept going to school because the demand was that I be better immediately. Immediately. And the insane part is I didn't even know who I was. So if trauma starts at 6, 7, 8 years old, how do you know who you are?
Yeah.
Right.
And so how do I know the next step forward when I've never been able to trust my own feet? It's just, so that's part of my passion, is really helping direct care service providers, law enforcement, advocates to see each survivor as themselves and not through their own particular lens. It's important.
That is so hard to do, because that requires nuance, and it requires longer amounts of times, and it requires mess. You know, like the messiness of no one story looks the same. So
Right.
no one human being is going to have the same journey, the same recovery, which means we in the community can't create this 5-step plan for you
Right.
because every single human being I'm going to come in contact with is going to need a little bit of something different. And that's a hard thing for us to swallow when we want outcomes and we want to see this was this and this was this and look what happened, and that's a challenge. Yeah.
And a clear indication of a direct care service provider, advocate, not really giving a survivor the space they need to recover well is when you express disappointment and frustration. So many times in my emerging, I would have a direct care service provider, advocate, say I relapsed or I went back to the street. When I'd come back in, they were angry with me. They were frustrated and disappointed. Now I understand that your heart hurts.
Sure.
But to put that on me as if I don't have disappointment and frustration with myself, you only just doubled down on what I have to carry.
Right.
And I don't want to carry your frustration when I have a lifetime of frustration and disappointment of my own.
Wow.
You actually have just made my journey just a little bit harder, even though I know you love me, even though I know you care. And so, you know, it's just important that we don't project our disappointment and frustration. Let your heart ache, but I probably don't want to know about it.
Right. That is
Wow.
huge.
That's so good.
That is huge.
Yeah.
It touches me to see whenever these type of outcomes play out with direct service care providers, because I know that, like you said, there's this desire to see results, but in the messiness, as you put it, those results take time, and each person is going to have a different hurdle to overcome. And so I love how when you talk about if I relapse, which should be expected because research goes behind it, there's going to be relapse. That's a part of the healing and growing journey, especially when there's addictions involved. And so when the victim who is trying to survive relapses and being met with that disappointment, and even the banter, the conversation that happens in the background, just the entire mindset. Oh my God, this happened. You know, we gave her everything that she needed, yet she still failed. Okay, think about that. The conversations have to change. You know, oh, she just couldn't follow the rules. I'm sorry, there's so much more. Maybe this is the first time I've had structure.
Yeah.
Okay, and so it takes time, and there's research behind how long it takes to break a habit. You know, and how many cycles of that just for one habit. And so I think that that's a very critical piece, because this is where I know I've let many people down along the way. I did not have the direct service care providers. It was my family, right? And those who were close enough to me that would try to help and knew just a little bit about my story, because I was not very honest about what I experienced until recently. And I remember, which is common, because I want to hide. I really don't want everyone to see all of this going on. And so when you're trying to pick yourself back up, and I suffered from suicidal ideation for many, many years, until not even that long ago, where I still would get in this funk, battling with depression, battling with bipolar disorder, battling with the battle scars of coming out of that life, and then meeting that wall where someone has been like, okay, by now, you should have this together.
On you,
right? So imagine the person coming out of the program or in a program who has even less time. I can look back over the past 30 years of recovery. I'm still on a healing journey. So imagine the individual who only has this short period of time. They're fresh out of the gate of the life. They really need a lot more empathy. Yes, they need the structure, but structure could be new. Right? And so there's conversations surrounding what it looks like that has to change. Because if it's happening behind the scenes and then you're encountering the individual and then you're expressing that, it's like, we need a lot of hope.
Yeah.
We need a lot of, you can do this.
Yes.
We need a lot of, you might have failed this time, but you can get back up.
So good.
Right? And then we're going to come and partner alongside with you as you're going through this.
So good.
Because otherwise, otherwise you can sink so low to where you just end your life and say, this is not worth it. This is too much. And that's the reality. And you have seen that. If you have been in this line of advocacy any length of time, you've seen those who gave up.
Yep.
These are some of the reasons why. Not saying that that's the reason.
Sure.
The trauma is the reason.
Sure.
But along the way, it's a life or death issue.
Real. So real. We've had, over the last, I think, a little over 2 years, we've had about 9 survivors that we serve die for various reasons. Some of them suicide, some of them homicide, drug addiction, those types of things. And you wonder, I mean, you can't go too far down, but you just wonder, what expectations were put on them that may not have needed to be put on them. That added, like you said, Vet, to these layers. Like I already got my own weight I'm dealing with my own shame. And then, because I'm just thinking of, I think that survivors are, some of the most brilliant people readers I know. You've had to be a good people reader to survive. And then you come into services and whether it's said or not in front of your face, you're aware that they're disappointed in you and those types of things. And so those do add layers that, you never know what that's adding up to.
Yes.
So we talk about kind of like the physical exit when it was sort of like out of the life. But what about kind of more like emotional and like cognitive freedom? What has that journey looked like for you?
So my journey toward cognitive, spiritual, mental health, emotional health, well-being, I think for me, it began with finding a place to be stable, like shelter. It's true, is it Maslow's hierarchy of need? Before I could dream, before I could heal, I needed a space, a restorative space. I never got that, but for whatever reason, I was, there's this tenacity that comes with having lived in adverse circumstances for so long. And so I used what was provided. And then, to be honest, Lindsey, my change began when I disrupted the God talk. So as a survivor who has endured a great deal of religious trauma and violence, I had to re-engage God. And for me, ontologically, that's where it began. That's where change began for me. And when I could deal with how I felt about myself intrinsically, then I could fight the banter that was in my head. I could war against self-loathing, and I could create a narrative that no longer made me a victim, but made me powerful. Because manure can be used as fodder, or you can sling it, and it does no good. So I chose to take the crap that was given to me and create a garden. And so I just started dealing with, why do I say this about myself? Why do I feel like God is saying this about me? And oftentimes it was because the church was like, God is so disappointed with you. God is angry with you. And so for me, that when I created a God, I don't want to say create, but when I took the harsh, angry God and made that God kind and loving, the God that saw what happened to me as a little girl, the God that saw me in the closet crying, hiding from my abuser, when I switched it, that God loved me. And that God wasn't angry with me, but I had to step away from the noise, the crackle behind my lived experience so that I could re-engage it, like I said, from a deeply ontological space. And with that, the voices of people began to kind of fade. So you could walk up to me and say, oh, Vet, God is so disappointed that you relapsed. And now the voice of my God was, no, I'm not. I love you. I have always loved you. I am right here.
Love it.
And So if you can imagine when you have that conversation, then in your own headspace, when it's like, I can't do this, I can't change, I can't achieve,
Yeah.
that voice is, yes, you can. Yes, you can. Yes, you can. And that lends itself to mental health. It lends itself to
Yeah.
cognitive stability.
So good.
It allowed me to look at my trauma from a very different, a different place, an empowered space.
Wow.
And then my life began to stabilize. I asked advocates and direct care service providers to create better spaces and to change their theological language and imagery if it's unkind, especially to women who have endured sexual violence and trauma and who have been called all manner of names. Because recovery doesn't begin just because you give me 4 walls and a bed. Recovery begins when you allow your heart to be opened up for me so that I find a safe space to rest. It's the energy that you give to me because I don't have it. When I emerged from the life, I had nothing to give myself. And then you took God away from me by saying that God was mad at me. So now I'm afraid to go to God.
That's real.
So I need, a lot of times people are like, we need to get a house and we need to get a bed and mattresses and pillows and food in the pantry. Well, if you give me all of that and you do not give me love, you've given me very little.
Right.
And so I think it's important that when we're talking about stabilizing and emerging, that we realize that the human heart is the first resource. And then everything that comes after that, God can infiltrate with power.
That's golden.
Love that.
That's golden. That stirs up so much within me, Ved, because I think about, we have to talk about that, circle back to disappointment.
Yeah.
Whenever, whether it's service providers or family or whoever is deciding to come alongside of the survivor, disappointment is the most. So you mentioned us being people readers. You can tell when you have broken someone's heart, disappointed them, but what you do with that is it's hypercritical. And even in the space where I began to embrace therapy, there were so many different, even the journey of finding a therapist who, even though you have the book knowledge, that you can be able to translate that book knowledge on a case-by-case basis and not give cookie-cutter responses. Send me home with some papers and tell me, okay, go attack the world. It's like, it can, that even is overwhelming.
Fill this out.
Fill this out, right? Another personality
Assessment. Yes.
Thank you. Yes, I'm jacked up. I'm multiple here. I don't know which one I really
Thank you for revealing what I already knew.
But it's critical. As you were talking, what came to mind is the trainings in empathy, the trainings in sensitivity, the trainings in understandings, even cultural diversities, the way in which we approach our healing, and what is therapeutic. What is therapeutic in our own cultural contexts and settings. So there's a lot of nuances to look at as you're looking at the life of someone recovering from this level of trauma, right? So yeah.
What was it for you, that level of freedom that came, not physically, but
Right.
yeah.
Right. I definitely also started at the point of returning to my childhood faith. But what I realized is that over the years, that was not enough for me. I love how you touched on, I guess, the fear or the misrepresentation. It's really a misrepresentation of who God really is. That's very critical. That's very critical. And so as I, through the years, started to address the trauma, I didn't have an issue in the faith. I had an issue in the trauma. Once I started to address the trauma, then I was able to see God through a different lens to begin with, okay? And then I was able to look introspectively and begin a true healing journey, because one of the things that I felt all the time, which is very common with survivors, is this feeling of, I'm doing it wrong. Okay, I've got these set of expectations, but I'm doing it wrong.
Wow.
And so I constantly felt wrong. Even before God, in my private time, I felt like I'm not getting this right. Right. And so what is needed is is a reinforcement. And so I was able to get a few people along the way who were able to speak into me, because we do need people. It's not a journey that you're going to be able to take by yourself. I had to depend on people at times, and thankfully the right people were able to speak into and over the negative voices, even within the church, even within, faith-based settings. They were able to speak into the truth of, this is what it looks like to walk this out. And I'm going to come alongside of you, and you're going to fail. So expect that. And so when it's not that the expectations were lowered in my life, it's just that they gave me grace.
Yeah, they're realistic.
Like, you've been through a lot. And so I had to turn in, I would say within the past 6 or 7 years, I began to turn inward and correct those negative self-talk. Okay. That was one of the gems of therapy for me, is doubt that self-talk. That self-talk is lying. It is coming out of place of pain. It is not telling the truth about who you really are. Who you really are is resilient. Who you really are is powerful. To be able to still stand through all of what you've been through. And in your moments of weakness, you're still beautiful. You're still powerful. You're still successful, even though you failed, right? And so for me, I was able to, I would say over the past 7 years of my therapy journey, through many interventions, mental health interventions and hospitals, and finding the right therapist and that whole thing, I finally began to believe that this can turn around. This is figure outable. It's not neat.
Figure outable.
Right. It's not neat.
Yes.
But it is a process that is possible. Right. And so, I don't know if that answered the question.
Yeah.
I think
No,
it's
it
important
definitely
too that
did.
we really consider. I think I've used the word as well, failure. I think I need to be careful with that word, because it's really a manifestation of the symptoms of the trauma. To be exploited is a deeply traumatic wound, and to return to it is not a failure. It's a manifestation of that trauma. I just don't want other survivors to be listening to this conversation and use that language.
Right.
Because failure, for me anyway, with my level of trauma, is like echoing the word failure into the Grand Canyon. It's like failure. And so I think there might be a creative, more life-giving way to express that walking into trauma again, or walking into the symptoms of trauma again.
Or being lured back into
Or being
it.
lured back in, not as a failure, but as a caveat in the journey to recovery, maybe. I don't know, but I think it's important,
that there's that language shift.
That's life-giving. Failure feels death-dealing to me.
Yeah.
I felt a lot of sense of failure in the initial stages of going to therapy and being hospitalized. At times I felt like that was my greatest failure, because, I no longer was able to uphold this sense of strength. I looked at going to therapy or intensive outpatient or being hospitalized as a tremendous letdown. And so I still battle with that. Now I know that is not the case, but there's still these feelings of familiarity that equates. If I have to get care, and it's not a relapse per se, it is a need for care, right? If I have to reach out like that, then I don't have it together enough, and so I've had to endeavor to really challenge that internal voice that says this is a failure. So I don't believe it's a failure anymore, but I still battle it.
Sure.
I'm still going through therapy. I'm doing the, what is it? EMDR.
Yes.
I'm going through EMDR. But now I'm starting to look at it as, this is actually a win. This is actually me recognizing that there's a lot there, even after all these years that I have to walk through. And that's something that should be celebrated.
Yeah. I hope people are hearing the theme of all these years. Because it's like, you said 7 years at one point, and it's a journey. It's a long journey. And I think that's underrated, that journey in the community, what would you guys say to more, we talked a lot kind of like service provision, that kind of thing, and service providers, but like what about the community? Because the community is becoming more and more aware of trafficking, sometimes for better or for worse, because it's like kind of gone a little bit sensational and a little bit, there's a lot of myths that we're working to debunk, but what would you say to the community? What do you wish they knew about trafficking, about surviving, about what this takes to be on the other side of?
Can I go back real quick and just speak to something that Keeya said? I want direct care service providers to also know they need to be doing EMDR. I'm not sure why therapy is something for failing or for the wayward.
Yeah.
Every single person alive on this planet
Yeah.
that is old enough to talk.
Yes.
No, 6-year-olds need therapy. No, well, they might.
I mean, maybe.
I did.
Yeah.
But I want to really normalize
Yeah.
this. And when I speak to agencies, I say, whatever your clients are kind of going through, you want them to do self-care. You want them to eat well. You want them to drink water, get rest. You want them to exercise. You want them to do EMDR and therapy. And you're smoking cigarettes and drinking Coca-Cola to cope.
Right.
I need you. True advocacy and allyship is not only walking with me when my voice has been silenced and I have been pushed into the dark on the margins. It is walking with me in the light. It's walking with me on the beach. It's walking with me through everything that's helping me to emerge. I want my ally to be, embracing this, embodying the same things, because how can you be my ally or advocate when you yourself are kind of sick? And and we all are.
It's
but
hypocrisy.
I just want to normalize that especially if you, like I said, trauma for decades.
Yeah.
And then you come along beside me and you're not doing any of that work yourself.
Yeah.
Right.
So I just wanted to
I think
mention that it's important for
So good.
for the whole community
right.
to really be doing that work.
That's good.
So what was your question?
No, I will say, now I have to say, but because I just love that topic, but yeah, I think it was 6 or 7 years ago when I started therapy, but I've been in the work for about 10 or 11 or 12 now, I can't remember. But I got in thinking, oh, there's this issue, I want to help. And the closer I got to people who looked different than me and had a brokenness that I didn't necessarily relate to, the more the layers were peeled back on my own brokenness. And no, our brokenness didn't look the same, but we're both broken.
Right.
And it wasn't until I started going to counseling that I realized that how dare I be on the journey with someone else without being on my own journey? And how dare we as a movement attempt this work without being in the work ourselves? And it's just this matter, it's kind of a power dynamic, it's pride, thinking that just because different traumas and brokennesses are different, it just doesn't mean that they're not there.
Mine is worse than yours.
Yeah.
Right.
And if you think that mine is worse than yours, my trauma is worse than yours, then you might come in with the savior complex.
That's right.
Right.
And then I'm not going to be able to receive you.
Yeah.
Because I'm just not.
No.
I give this example when I ask advocates and allies to do the work of self-care, self-awareness, self-reflexivity, is to liken it to a doctor in the ICU. You don't get to just walk into the ICU without scrubbing and covering your shoes and putting on a full hazmat suit. And every time you go into a different room, you have to scrub down again. And so if we really looked at, that type of metaphor for like health and well-being when we go into spaces where we're serving the wounded, I always ask advocates, please do not bleed on the wounded. And so an ICU doctor does not go in with COVID or sick or with their hands dirty. they are very intentional about
Yeah.
entering that space, not to contaminate
Yeah.
or
Oh,
to
that's
bring
good.
dis-ease into disease, right?
Yeah. And it doesn't mean that they're perfect.
Right.
It doesn't mean that
Never perfection.
our job is to be perfect. It means our job is to be on the journey
Right.
for ourselves.
Right. To be
Yeah.
deliberate about our own wellness.
Yeah.
Intentional about it. Because
So
you're
good.
requiring that of me, Lindsey.
Yeah.
Right.
You're asking me to show up for myself and be better.
Right.
But I don't really see that energy coming from, the person. So
Wow.
one of the things that I would ask of community, and this is a passion of mine, is to really pay attention to community complicity. I know when I was on the streets, community was often complicit, whether it was indifference, and we often want to look at the issue of trafficking in these huge, broad strokes, these overarching themes. But the true underpinning of this industry, which is the industry of exploitation and economics, money, and all of that, really has to do with us paying attention to the people in our community. Before we want to raise a banner and be a part of a huge campaign, I ask community members, where do these systems supporting trafficking, where do they land in you? What legislators are you putting in place? What ballots are you casting, and for who? And where do they stand on the subjects or the issues that most impact the marginalized among us, the poor, the vulnerable, the indigenous, the Black, the Asian, the Latina, and other identities, the queer and trans community? Where does that intersect in who you are? Systems aren't changed by legislation. Systems are inherently changed by who we are.
That's amazing.
Good.
That's exactly why these type of conversations are necessary. Just as I'm going in between thinking about the importance of finding the right information, finding true information, and then having leaders to help navigate you through this process of figuring out how to make impact in your day-to-day lives.
Yeah.
Right? So that there will be a minimizing to what is going on in the space and in the industry of human trafficking. And it's in your backyard. This is not just something happening way over there or on that side of town. This is something that is happening on your college campuses. This is something that is happening on the internet. This is happening in your public schools. This is happening in foster care. This is happening outside of foster care. This is happening in homeschool. This is happening in so many different places and ways that almost seems unimaginable. But how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, said a very wise person, which I cannot think of at the moment. But I think it's Bishop Desmond Tutu. But the point of the matter is, we have to educate ourselves. We have to join in even as a survivor. When I began to educate myself on how this was impacting other victims and other people, it became quite overwhelming. And so that's why it's so important, the work that you do and the work that you do and the work that we all do to learn and then to educate and then to jump in the fight.
Yeah.
And to realize also, if there's anything within this conversation that is tugging on someone's heart, that is causing them to say, hold up, there is a way that I can help. Or I don't know how to help. You can be pointed in the right direction.
Yeah.
There's plenty of information
that
you can be pointed in the right direction and find out, how can I be a part of the solution? It takes everyday people, shoulder to shoulder, allies, advocates, survivors, to be able to bring about the solutions that is going to make the lasting change, right? Through many of the ways that you mentioned.
Right. So good. Well, this has been great. I could do this all day. I think there's been a lot of really good themes on just hearing the complexity in the matter, and that it's more than meets the eye. There's more to the story, I think, is always the theme, that there's more to the story. So, is there any last things that you guys wanted to say before we end?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for bringing survivor voices into this space. It's not only good for direct care service providers and everyone else that is involved in this dismantling this issue of trafficking. It's important for the person that's being exploited to hear that their journey is their journey, and not to feel condemned in the process, but that there's hope and love and light available. So I think that's important. So thank you.
Definitely. I think that what comes to mind as I look in my heart as being a survivor, the battle that is before you, to just stay engaged and to not give up is a tremendous battle. And even if you find yourself in a program that you feel like, oh, maybe this is not the right place for me, don't stop doing the work. Don't stop investing in yourself. You are worthy of the investment. And it may not look like the next person's story, right? It may take you longer. You may relapse. You may go in and out of these spaces feeling defeated, but you're not defeated. Just keep waking up. Keep showing up. Keep investing in yourself.
So
you
good.
are worth it. I am worth it. You are worth it. It's unimaginable to live through what we have lived through without support. And there's so much more support that is available, even though it's in need of fine tuning, and it's being fine tuning. It's tuned and it's being refined. It's imperfect. But I'm here for the messiness of it. I'm here for let's get in this fight and see different outcomes that are going to begin to reveal and manifest themselves 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the line. Right? And so this fight is worth it.
So good.
Yeah.
Let's get messy.
Let's get messy. We need t-shirts that say that. Let's get messy.
All right. Thanks, you guys.
Yeah.
Love y'all.